Welcome everybody to this session on evidence and measures of progress in international development. Really delighted to chair this session today. I should say by way of background that this session is also the launch formally of the RSS's new International Development Working Group. So we have about 20 of our fellows who've come together and said that this is a really important area which statisticians should be more involved with. They've organised this event here today, but I'm meeting on a sort of probably 3 times a year and organising all sorts of work. The work of the group is really threefold. One is the sort of classic learned society work, so sharing knowledge and good practice between statisticians. Secondly, around capacity building, so working with statisticians in other countries, in poorer countries, to build capacity. And finally, around advocacy, so ensuring that statistical input goes into the kind of key policy debates that are happening in international development. So I hope today's session will sort of feed into the work of that working group, as well as drawing more of our fellowship into that group. So if you're interested in finding out more, do drop me an email and I can put you in touch with the group. Anyway, today we've got 3 fabulous speakers who've come along to talk to us. I will sort of introduce them at kind of headline level now, but then we'll also tell you a bit about each one as they step up to speak. So we've got Neil Jackson, who's Chief Statistician at the Department for International Development. Suman Seth, a Research Officer at the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. And then Alex Cobham, who's a Research Fellow at the Centre for Global Development. So it's a really good panel. I'm conscious it's an all-male panel, but all the women we approached were far too busy, which is why you've got the sort of second-rate men who are available, and that's genuinely the case, but we did make an effort. We were turned down, I'm afraid. So I'm going to hand over to Neil to kick us off with a sort of overall introduction to the issues and the landscape. And Neil, prior to being at DFID, he's just started this year as their Chief Statistician, worked for 4 years at the UK Statistics Authority, which is also a friend of the Society, so coming in from a very good place. Neil.
Thank you very much, Hetan. Right, well, I'm very pleased to be here. As Hetan says, I'm sort of new to international development, and it's a very exciting time to be here with a lot of work going on in terms of the post-2015 development agenda. And I very much welcome the new working group in international development, and I'm looking for DFID to sort of engage with RSS members in terms of taking things forward, so that's very exciting. And this is a very good topic we've got to start, measures of progress in international development, which could fill many sort of pages and hours, but I'm going to sort of focus a little bit, just a little bit of context in terms of 20th century, from GDP to sustainable development indicators, and then I'll talk a little bit about the Millennium Development Goals, but particularly thinking what sort of lessons we can learn from that in terms of the post-2015 development agenda and the role of statistics in that. So, in 1992, Bill Clinton in his presidential campaign said, "It's the economy, stupid," and by that he meant economics really is, the thing that really matters most to people whenever you boil everything down. And when you think of progress in the 20th century, it really had a sort of strong economic focus, and the sort of primary measure of that really is GDP. It's sort of like the headline measure of progress, and this is a sort of very, very important measure in many ways. And closely related to it is gross national income, which is a little bit different in terms of it's the income of residents in a country, taking account of what they earn from overseas and also losing whatever it is that they send abroad. And so it's GNI provides a bit of an idea of what a society's sort of capacity is to look after the well-being of its citizens. In an international development context, the World Bank use gross national income per capita as an important measure in terms of classifying different countries. The different classifications are low income, middle income and high income, and we often split middle income into lower and upper, and often you think of the low and middle income countries as being the developing countries. So that's, if you like, in terms of international development, the sort of scope. These are the thresholds they used in 2012. So roughly, if your income is $1,000 a year or less per head, that's low income. And it's about $1,000 to $4,000 lower middle income, and then $4,000 to $12,500 or so up to middle income. And this actually this measure actually has got some important implications. So in terms of getting concessional loans from the World Bank, you really need to be a low-income country or not eligible. And likewise, in terms of official development assistance, which is the money that goes into developing countries, you wouldn't be eligible for assistance in terms of what's reported officially unless you're in the low or middle income categories. So it does have important implications, these measures. If you look here, you can sort of see just at a glance how the world is divided up. And in terms of the very low income countries, they are sort of heavily sort of concentrated in the sort of sub-Saharan African areas. The list itself of these categories has been changing over the years, and since 1970 there have been more countries have been exiting into sort of high income countries. There's been a bit of migration, which is sort of a sign of progress in itself, perhaps. Now, GNI, or gross national income, although it is a good measure, it has some sort of important limitations. And I think there's sort of three main challenges to it, perhaps, in very, very general terms. One is it actually a good measure of economic performance? Another question is, does it actually tell you enough about what matters in terms of current well-being? And then the third issue is in terms of sustainability and one's ability to maintain one's level of current well-being into the future. GDP doesn't really tell you that much about that. So increasingly, people have been dissatisfied with GDP as a sort of headline measure. And there was this sort of landmark report, which I'm sure many people will have heard of, in 2009. So the authors are Stiglitz, Sen, and Fitoussi. It's usually referred to as the Stiglitz report. But this was really looking at measures of economic performance and social progress. And in many ways, this was sort of setting out a blueprint for the 21st century in terms of what we should be using as measures of progress. And it was really aimed both at developing countries and at developed countries. So the idea is this should apply across the piece. In terms of, it distinguished, it provided a sort of critique of classical GDP, but it also devoted some time to sort of having a broader set of measures of current well-being. And this is sort of like a rough account of some of those. And in terms of sustainability, it presented sustainability in terms of stocks. So it talked about natural capital, physical capital, human capital, and social capital. And the idea is if you can measure changes in those are the sort of things that give you an indication of whether in fact your current well-being will be sustainable. But in terms of these measures, material living standards is where your sort of classic GDP comes in, but obviously there's a range of other factors that are also important. And this report has been highly influential and has stimulated a huge amount of initiatives to develop all sorts of new measures of social development, sustainable development indicators. One of the important, most recent developments was in 2012. There was a United Nations conference on sustainable development, and an upshot of that is called the Rio Plus 20 conference. And as a result of that, 30 member states were mandated to form an open working group to go away and come back in the next year or two and report on a series of sustainable development goals. So this is really looking to the 2015, when the current Millennium Development Goals come to an end, what should replace it? So that's one sort of activity in the international forum that's already sort of up and running. There's another sort of piece of work that's looking much more at the sort of international development context, thinking about what will replace the Millennium Development Goals. And there was a sort of very important report that was published earlier this year, which is, again, the United Nations Secretary General appointed a high-level panel of eminent persons, and they produced what's known as the high-level panel report, and this is actually co-chaired by our own Prime Minister. And that group was set two challenges. One was to promote, how do we promote sustainable development, and the other is how do we end extreme poverty. So there's these sort of two challenges. And in May this report was published, and that set out a number of proposals looking ahead to 2015. But what it sort of said is we shouldn't really be starting from scratch. We've already got actually a good framework in place, which is the Millennium Development Goals. So I backtrack a little bit and talk a little bit about what these Millennium Development Goals are. There are 8 of them. These came in the year 2000 really from the Millennium Declaration, which was a sort of huge achievement in that 189 countries agreed to a number of sort of high-level, fairly specific commitments, of which one was to sort of halve global poverty. So it's a very important agreement. And the following year, the Secretary General published what he calls a roadmap towards implementing the Millennium Development Goals. And that's where the sort of framework of what we now know as the MDG framework came about. There's really eight goals here, and they do map across a little bit to the sort of the themes of different multi-dimensions of welfare in the last slide that the Stiglitz report identified. So number one, extreme poverty, obviously that's to do with material well-being, access to material goods and consumption. Number two clearly ties up with education. In terms of health, number four, reduce child mortality, 5, maternal health, and 6, combat HIV/AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. Those have all got a sort of health theme. And also one of the multi-dimensions was environment. So number 7 is ensure environmental sustainability. So it chimes a little bit with the sort of headlines that sort of the Stiglitz report identified. Number 3, slightly different in kind, promote gender equality and empower women. And that cuts across quite a lot of the other dimensions of well-being. And then the 8th one is also different in kind, a global partnership for development. And this was really responding to something that was in the Millennium Declaration, and this, which it sort of said that we need to create an environment at the national and global levels alike which is conducive to development and to the elimination of poverty. So that's a sort of a new sort of strand to when we think of sustainable development. The sort of traditional pillars are economy, society, environment. There's increasingly views that institutions and governance are also important. And back in 2000, this is recognised as something that's important. That is one of the development goals. So the Millennium Development Goals aren't just a series of goals. It is a sort of framework, and one of its great strengths is a mixture of goals, targets, and indicators. This is actually an extract from the recent high-level report, but it does really describe in some ways these 3 different features of the MDG framework. And I think that the great power of this is it combines something that's quite visionary in terms of what you're trying to achieve with very specific targets in terms of what you're going to achieve that are time-bound. So you're giving a particular deadline of when you're going to meet them. And it's also allied to indicators, which sort of sets out how are you going to measure progress. Now, from a statistics point of view, that's hugely important. In sense, it sort of says statistics have got a key role in international development. Again, referring back to Stiglitz report, it sort of compared our world leaders with a sort of pilot who doesn't have a compass. If you don't know, if you have a compass, you don't know where you're going or whether you're making any progress. And the idea of statistics obviously are hugely important within this framework. It's important for policymakers because it sort of says, well, what is the scale of the challenge that we're facing? What is it we're trying to achieve? It also tells you whether you're making progress. So insofar you report on whether you're making progress or not, it tells you whether you're on track or not. And that again provides a feedback loop in terms of what more do you need to do if you're going to meet these targets. But the other important dimension of statistics is the sort of the open information. So it gives information to citizens and social institutions to hold policymakers to account. So if you've got agreement at a political level that you're going to hit certain targets, then if the information is out there whether you're achieving those targets or not, then you can be held account to it. And it's the statistics that provide that sort of feedback loop. I'd like to take a slightly closer look at the framework, maybe look at 1 or 2 examples. So, Goal 1, eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. And that was accompanied by 3 targets actually, but one we look at here is halve between 1990 and 2015 the proportion of people whose income is less than $1 a day. $1 is a sort of, that dates back to 1990, it's actually 1993, I think it was $1.08. And we often now refer to $1.25, which is in 2005 prices. But this is really sort of setting it an absolute international poverty line. It's sort of saying that that is an international standard, and the target is to reduce by half the number of people living below that absolute minimum level of subsistence, if you like. And the goal of three specific targets to go at that. So we'll look at these in turn. So the first target is, or the first indicator rather to go with the target, is the proportion of the population below $1 a day. Again, I sort of oscillate between $1.25 and $1. That's just it's the same measure, just depending what year you're looking at or what prices. And interestingly, in terms of the results for the developing regions as reported by the United Nations, in 1990 there were 46.7% of the population of these countries were living below this absolute subsistence line. And 2010, we've actually hit the target. So it's quite a big achievement, down to 22%. And the United Nations reports this information in an annual report each year. So the chart showing where it's all come from. And the interesting thing about here is actually in Eastern Asia, it started off about 60% in 1990. The target of halving it's gone down to about 12% now. And that's nearly all China. In fact, those are the figures for China. So although great progress has been made, there's still a lot of people. I think in terms of numbers, there's still about 1.2 billion people in the world who are still living below this subsistence threshold. Nevertheless, this information allows that target to be reported on, which is a great strength. The second indicator, I won't spend too long on this, I probably better read out the definition so I get it right. The poverty gap ratio is the mean distance separating the population from the poverty line expressed as a percentage of the poverty line. And people who are rich or who are above the poverty line are given 0. And again, this shows this 16% in 1990, and then it's moved to 6.8%. That provides a little bit more context in terms of this target. The third one is more about distribution indicators, the share of the per quintile in national consumption. So I went to the United Nations to see what is happening in this one, and got the message: no global or regional data are available. And this is actually sort of one of the weaknesses of the framework, that it set out a lot of really good goals and targets, but in many cases there isn't actually the ability to measure this. And even now, this was set in 2000, 13 years later, we still aren't able to report on that. And that is actually a great challenge in terms of being able to have the information. We rely on developing countries' own statistical services to generate a lot of the data, and in many cases they aren't well placed to do that. So in terms of the Sustainable Development Agenda, we talk about going beyond GDP, but at the United Nations Statistics Commission this year, someone said, well, you can't go beyond GDP if you don't have a measure of GDP. So it is a big challenge, it is a problem. I just said just a little bit more, just through looking at some of the other aspects of the MDGs where there have been sort of criticisms of it. Before I go into this, though, I think the important thing to emphasize is this was a huge achievement. Getting all these countries to agree on a set of high-level goals and then to sign up on measurable indicators was absolutely fantastic. I don't know how they did it, but that's there, it's being reported on, so we shouldn't really denigrate that achievement. But the important thing now is to look to sort of see, well, how could it be better in the context of post-2015? So one of the challenges is the targets were sort of top-down. It was sort of seen as the international donor community. They came up with the things that mattered, and this was sort of done to developing countries. These are the things that they need to sort of take seriously and report on. And I think for post-2015, there's general acceptance that needs to be much wider debate. It needs to be a partnership, coming back to this goal 8 of partnership working. It has to be a partnership between all the different players, and if you're not involved in setting the targets, if you don't have ownership of it, then it's not really going to be very worthwhile. You're not going to have the commitment you need. So that's a very important lesson for the future. I said, for the indicator we looked at, the baseline was 1990. That was the same across the board. Even though the millennium was the year 2000 was when it was set, and the reason it was 1990, again, it comes back to the quality of the data. They had to go back to 1990 to be able to provide enough information to provide a baseline, although in some cases they didn't even have that. So the high-level panel report has sort of said what we do need for the next one is we need a 2015 baseline, and again we'll come back to that, but that's quite a challenge, but it's a very good aspiration. Whenever you set your targets, your baseline should be as up to date as possible. The other aspect of the targets was, were these targets global or were they national? There's some confusion. They were meant to be global targets. A lot of countries reported individually in terms of how they did, and in some ways it meant that you could sort of say although we've halved poverty, China alone has sort of made a huge contribution to that, but very large places haven't been sort of captured in that, and therefore one of the things in the high-level panel report, it said whenever we set new targets, they should be universal. We should be setting things that are universal goals should apply for everybody. The idea is your goals and targets should be sort of smart, they should well be aligned, and I think in not every case was that the case. For goal 3, promote gender equality and empower women, there was only one target. So when this does relate to the goal, it's a sort of partial if you think of the different aspects of gender equality. education is one important part, but there's many others. There's just one target. And in terms of the indicators for measuring progress against this, 2 out of the 3 indicators didn't have a sort of direct bearing on the target. So this is about seats by women in national parliament. I did put up a slide which I didn't retain, but actually showed if you compare developing countries with developed countries, the developing countries actually have got slightly better performance than the developed world on this indicator, which is a very interesting finding. Other things is in terms of the measurement having a clear numerical yardstick, some of these goals sort of rather lack that. So there's a goal 1, or this target, full and productive employment, decent work for all. Not quite so easy to pin that down as a measurement. Equally, universal access to reproductive health, not such an easy thing to measure. So again, I think what we need in what the high-level panel called for is any new goals and targets, they do need to be quantifiable. That's one of sort of the lessons from that. So, I'm sort of coming to the end really, but in terms of some of these findings, it seems to me the high-level panel report has taken stock of a lot of the lessons from the Millennium Development Goals. It's provided a sort of illustrative set of goals in terms of what might be chosen for post-2015, and this is sort of a starting point for debate. And these are the ones, and I think if you look at them, they are certainly broader than the 8. They chime a little bit more widely with some of the sort of themes from the Stiglitz report. So you've got poverty, you've got the empowered girls and women, gender equality was there before. You've also got education, health. So if you like, right down to number 6, these are all different aspects, I think, of the idea of current well-being. 7, 8 and 9 are more about, there's more reference to sustainability, sustainable energy, sustainable livelihoods, managing natural resources sustainably. So this is about thinking about how you ensure your current well-being can last into the future. And then other sort of different ones in kind, again, this chimes this idea of a 4th pillar of governance, and institutions as being important. Number 10 is like that. 11, stable and peaceful societies is a new theme. And create a global enabling environment and catalyst for long-term finance is another sort of specific enabling aspect. The high-level panel report, one of the big challenges it threw out was that in terms of measuring these things, so it had the good framework. Not only did it sort of say we have to measure all these things, it said we have to measure these things in a very disaggregated way, because what they sort of said, for the future, no one should be left behind. And that's a very powerful message, but in terms of measurement, that increases the measurement challenge enormously. So if you think that there's a big shortfall at present in terms of measuring the Millennium Development Goals, how do you do that for even more goals, more targets, and much more detailed measurement? That's a massive challenge. The high-level panel report's response to that is sort of saying we need a data revolution, was the term, which is quite a good term. It sort of combines sort of what we think is rather dry and boring sort of data with sort of exciting revolution and brings it together and makes sort of data seem interesting. But some of the things in that, it sort of said we need more resources for statistics, in particular to help developing countries develop their own statistical capacity so that they can generate the numbers that are needed. It also called for a global partnership for development data. And a good starting point for this is to start work now on a baseline for 2015. So that's a huge challenge. The global partnership must be right in terms of development data. And I'll finish by saying, in terms of the new working group for the RSS on international development, I think the group should see itself as part of this global partnership, and DFID would like to work with you, thinking about how we can help shape this post-2015 development agenda. So thanks very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Neil. One wonders with a long list like this whether there's room for goals 13 and 14 for motherhood and apple pie as well. But, clearly there's always this sort of tension between trying to specify everything but also having a small enough number that you can get your head around it and sort of concentrate as it were. So that's a tension, I think, that needs to be managed. Now I'm going to invite Dr. Suman Seth to come up and speak. He's a research officer at the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. He's got a PhD in economics from Vanderbilt University and is an economist, and he's served as a consultant to the Regional Bureau of Latin America, the Caribbean, UNDP, Development Research Groups at the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. So Suman's going to give us more of a theoretical perspective and also talk us through the new multi-dimensional indicator that they've been working on at his institute. Thank you.
Thank you. Neil provided a nice description of our overview of where we stand at this moment and the need, the evolution. Of course, I completely agree. That is something very clear. I will focus mostly on poverty and in the measurement perspective, the role of joint distribution to look things jointly. Of course, we have to meet separate goals, but joint distribution, looking at joint distribution, or looking at them jointly, has its own role and it can solve some of the problems. Then I will talk about the new multidimensional poverty index that of researchers have developed. It was introduced in 2010. And then finally, I will close by discussing where a new multidimensional poverty index can fit in post-2015 discussion. So although we need a data revolution, but it is also true that over the last few, or rather 1 or 2 decades, we have access to a lot of data, a lot of household service, health service, demographic health service, World Health Service, data set by UNICEF. And there have been improved methodologies as well. And with new computer skills, we can really handle big data sets much better than we could do 10, 15 years ago. Of course, what we need to make economic growth more inclusive. Of course, real economic growth, I will show you some examples, does not solve other social deprivations. There is a need to go beyond income poverty. Of course, eliminating extreme poverty is one goal, but whether just eliminating extreme poverty automatically eliminate other social deprivations, that's still a question. Actually, it does not. Also, to go beyond dazzling complex dashboard of indicators, we have 48 indicators. Now, if we want to know if progress has been made or not, we go through the 48 indicators and then, coming up with a conclusion whether progress has been made or not, it's really difficult. There, I will discuss that joint distribution may be more useful to incorporate. And path ahead. Of course, there has been a political critique. 2009 Stiglitz-Fitosi Commission report criticized the use of current matrices. The 2010 Human Development Report introduced a new set of development indices, which sparked a great debate. So to start with, I give an example from South Asia. It was motivated by an article of John Rees and Amartya Sen in 2011. As you can see in blue color, it shows that India's economic growth has been much faster than the economic growth of Bangladesh and Nepal. Now, if you look at sort of the gray colors, its progress in other indicators has been dismal compared to the neighbors. Neighbors has been much poorer in terms of income. So economic growth may not always necessarily inclusive, and it is true for many other countries. Looking at the Global Monitoring Report progress status, it shows that in green colors, how many countries have made the target or made sufficient progress. The red color shows insufficient progress, moderately off target, or seriously off target. As you can see, the target has been made nearly 80 countries for which data are available in reducing extreme poverty. However, it has not translated to reduction or improvement in other social indicators, social deprivations. So, income poverty does not automatically take care of other deprivations. And so there is definitely a need to look at other indicators, maybe dashboards. However, if we look at the MDG dashboards separately, what we may miss? Let us consider a simple example. Suppose we have 4 persons and we have 4 MDG indicators. Now we can see in the first case 1, each person is deprived in one indicator. In the second case, one person is deprived in all indicators. Now if we look at MDG separately, it's 25% deprivation in each indicator. However, that may conceal the fact in case 2, one person is really severely deprived. quite rightly so, in the high-level panel report, it was mentioned that MDGs did not focus enough on reaching the very poorest. And the question is, who are these very poorest? Only the extreme, those who are deprived in terms of extreme poverty, or they're deprived in several MDGs or several dimensions at the same time, so that they don't have any escape route. Another UN document says the acceleration in one goal often speeds up progress in other. To meet MDGs strategically, we need to see them all together, not looking at them separately. And then finally, in Stiglitz and Fitowsi Commission report, they agree that the reason why the MDG dashboard has not been as popular as GDP, probably a single index, a single summary measure is more powerful in conveying a message than a dashboard of indicators. So, what a multidimensional approach, I'm talking in terms of poverty only, but it can also be discussed in terms of progress or development as well. But here, what a multidimensional approach in poverty can do, it can provide an overview, first of all. It can show progress quickly and directly if they are based on direct indicators, as I will show you with an example. It can inform planning policy, it can help target poor people and communities, and it may reflect people's understanding. So let me move on and give you a brief overview of what this multidimensional poverty index is about. So it is based on the methodology that James Foster and Sabine Alka developed in 2011. So first it selects dimensions, indicators, and weights or value. They value each indicator based on normative judgments. It sets then the deprivation cutoff for each indicator after they have been selected. Apply the indicators for each person from the same survey. So this is something that goes beyond composite indices. The data has to be available from the same survey in order to understand the joint distribution. The next stage, set a poverty cutoff to identify who should be identified as poor among those deprived, and then finally compute a measure called adjusted headcount ratio. And the MPI, the multidimensional poverty index, is an adaptation of this index, and it was first computed by, of course, Sabine Alka, my colleague, and Maria Mazuntos, and it was reported in the Human Development Report 2010. And the people are identified in two stages. First, each person, they are identified whether they are deprived or not in each dimension, and then in the second stage, if they have sufficient number of deprivations, they are identified as poor, in simple terms. The MPI can be expressed as simply as a product of two components. One is the percentage of people that are multidimensionally poor, which is denoted by H, and A is the average proportion of deprivation suffered by the poor. These are the indicators that were available to compute the global MPI. So mind you, that it sole purpose of constructing the global MPI was to find a complement of $1.25 a day. That means in order to be able to compare countries at the global level. So of course, the choice of indicator were restricted by that and also by the data availability. It has been implemented or modified by countries to produce a national MPI at the national level. But the global level, these are the 10 indicators that have been selected to construct the MPI. There are 3 pillars or dimensions: education, health, and standard of living. And there are indicators in between them, inside the dimensions. How someone is identified as poor? So this is the scale where we have 2 nutrition indicator, 2 education indicator, and 6 asset indicators. And suppose Grace is deprived in 1 nutrition indicator and 4 standard of living indicator. That makes Grace's score to 39% of all the weighted indicators that sum up to 100%. And a cutoff is said that if the sum of these weighted deprivations is greater than or equal to 33.3% or 1/3, then a person is identified as poor. So a person can be deprived but may be identified as non-poor. But you must have, or a person must have at least this level of deprivation to be identified as poor. United Nations also defined another cutoff, that if somebody is deprived between 20% and 33%, they are identified as vulnerables in the 2010 report. Properties useful for policy. I will just show you some examples how it can influence policy. But the main points are it can be broken down in intensities and incidents to understand how the progress in poverty reduction has been made. It is decomposable across population subgroups to understand a subgroup's contribution to the overall poverty. And then overall poverty can be broken down across dimensions to understand which dimension has contributed more towards the overall poverty. Let me show you some example to go beyond the boring theory. So this is an example constructed by my colleague, Suman. So suppose we have two countries with similar level of deprivation. There's similar MPI and it's similar headcount ratio and average deprivation share among the poor. Suppose in one country, poverty reduction policy had without inequality focus, in a sense that headcount has been reduced to this level, so that proportion of the people were taken out of poverty. However, the poor that probably taken out of poverty were marginally poor. Okay, they were not deeply poor. As a result, their average deprivation share did not go down much. Okay? In another situation, similar number of poor has been taken out of poverty. So if we just look at the headcount ratio, what $1.25 a day looks, similar headcount ratio, similar reduction in the proportion of poor people. However, here probably the poorest of the poor has been helped more. As a result, the average deprivation share had a large drop and just driving down the overall poverty measure, the MPI, much more. So similar reduction in headcount ratio, but this poverty measure reflects whether this particular reduction has been pro-poor or not. Here is an example of Nepal and Bangladesh. So Nepal, we had data for a gap of 5 years, and for Bangladesh we had 3 years. However, they had similar reduction per annum. But you can see how the reduction pattern has gone. Bangladesh reduced intensity relatively more. So if Bangladesh follows the same pattern, Bangladesh will end up somewhere here with similar MPI. Okay? So it's H and A did not go hand in hand in both countries. We also applied a detailed MPI for a detailed country study, intertemporal study to India, and we tried to then decompose across groups, try to understand how different subgroups performed in India. Unfortunately, the picture is not very happy, because when we did this subgroup decomposition, most of the time we found that the poorest group made least progress. So Muslims, to start with in 1999, they were the poorest. They made least progress. Scheduled tribes, which is the poorest group in India, also made least progress. When we moved to the state level, again, we found that the southern state reduced multidimensional poverty index much faster than northern states, and actually these southern states were already less poorer to begin with in 1999. When we compared the reduction in multidimensional poverty index to the reduction of income poverty, definitely we did not get one-to-one correspondence. There were discrepancies. In fact, when we tried to pull up a linear trend, we found that the states that were highly poor, more poor, reduced MPI less. The income poverty was a different story. It showed that those states that were highly poor in terms of income poverty, they reduced headcount ratio more. So it was a striking picture. So it's similar period, but you have these striking pictures to show that income poverty does not necessarily reduce deprivation in other dimensions, not even jointly. And then what we can show, again for policy analysis, which dimensions actually drive the reduction in the overall poverty. The standard of living indicators, although weighted less, had shown much more progress than the other health and education related indicators. again, for policy analysis, if you want to go at the state level, these are the two states, Kerala and Andhra Pradesh, which reduced the NPI most. However, they took different patterns. There were more balanced reduction in all indicators for Andhra Pradesh than Kerala. And finally, to understand if it is possible to target the poorest of the poor, these two pie charts breaks down the intensities that the poor face. So, this many people, this fraction of people in Madagascar are deprived between 30 to 40% of indicators. They are 40 to 50%, 50 to 59, and so on. And you will see, although they have similar MPI, similar headcount rates, the proportion of people who are poor by more than 60% of indicators is much larger in Madagascar than in Rwanda. So it also helps you, this measure, to show, if you break it down, that where these more deprived people live, and then sort of set your target accordingly. So to conclude, just to discuss how MPI can fit in post-2015. This is a picture that we had this year. So the height here shows the MPI headcount ratios, and the dots shows $1.25 a day headcount ratio. And again, there is enough mismatch. And probably you will see it later as well. And not only cross-section in a period of time, but also when we look at the change in poverty, then also there is a huge mismatch in headcount ratio, improvement in terms of headcount ratio, improvement in terms of MPI. So the idea is not to replace $1.25 a day. $1.25 a day has its own strength in terms of understanding the change in income poverty. And income is important. But if income poverty is not driving reduction in other indicators, straightforward, there is requirement for a complementary measure that can track other kind of progress beside $1.25 a day. And it can also show the interconnections between dimensions, how they are doing in terms of identifying those who are deprived in many dimensions at the same time. And a misunderstanding that many people have, that MPI is a composite index. There was a huge debate between Martin Revelians, James Foster, and Sabine Alkar in 2010. Martin thinking it of as a composite index. It is not. It goes very much beyond a composite index. Look at the micro data set and try to understand. And I showed you what can be done using the MPI, which cannot be done using a simple composite index. So definitely it can show the joint deprivation, distribution of deprivations. It can be informative in terms of looking at change across groups, change across indicators, what has contributed to the overall change. Countries can tailor-made the MPI in their context. Colombia has done that, Mexico has done that. Bhutan has applied in a different context in the measurement of progress rather than measurement of poverty. And feasibility in terms of data, it uses only 39 indicators out of the 625 questions from the demographic health survey. So it's not very demanding in that sense that it requires collection of a lot of data. Just to end, OFI recently launched a global multidimensional poverty peer network, and the idea is for countries to come together and help each other. For example, Morocco was there, who have already visited Mexico and Colombia, to learn from them how they have implemented and how it has helped for them to build national poverty measures. So we had nearly 20 countries participated. It was joined, the event was joined by President Juan Manuel Santos of Colombia, and of course Nobel laureate Amartya Sen. The team is meeting again in 3 weeks in New York. And the attendees are ministers from Philippines, Nigeria, Mexico, Colombia, El Salvador, again the president of Colombia. And again, the main idea is to discuss a possible MPI 2.0 with a new agreed set of indicators in the post-2015 era. because this country ministers, at least, they're not satisfied with the current matrices such as $1.25 a day GDP and others. So I stopped here, and I will move on to let Alex speak.
Thanks very much, Suman, for a really interesting insight into this new indicator. Finally, over to Alex Cobham, who's a research fellow at the Centre for Global Development. And the CGD is, I understand, a leading American think tank on international development, but with now a small European arm, which is where Alex is working. Alex has had an illustrious career in international development, having been head of research at Save the Children, and having worked at Christian Aid before that, and a number of bits of research in academia before that. And he's particularly well known for his work on illicit financial flows. Alex.
Thank you. I'm going to abuse the privilege of going last to do something less serious than either of my two fellow panelists. I think they've given you a really great sense of where the discussion is around data for the post-MDGs, for post-2015. And particularly, the work that OFI's doing is really pushing the boundaries of what we can expect from data. So I want to do something very different. I'm just going to touch on a few similar things. I want to talk about the politics of development statistics, which will largely be me having a rant and trying to fit it into 15 minutes. Uncounted was the title of a blog that I used to run at Save the Children. The idea behind it was that there are two different types of things that don't get counted properly in international development, broadly defined. And they're defined by things and people that have an excess of power and things and people that don't have enough power. So at one end, and this is where my work on illicit financial flows comes in, at one end you can think of everything around the whole area of financial secrecy, the assets and the capital flows and the profit streams that end up running through tax havens or secrecy jurisdictions, I prefer, that aren't counted because of the power of the people involved in those processes. And at the other end, the people who, because of their particular forms of poverty, are simply not counted in the development statistics. One thing I really hope will start to come from the work that OFI are doing is a much greater focus on who it is who gets counted in things like the DHS surveys. A number of people, particularly Roy Carr-Hill at the University of London, has done a lot of work on those surveys, who it is who's systematically missed out. And of course it's the poorest of the poor. It's nomadic groups, it's people living with disabilities, certain sorts of children, people in and out of broken homes, people living on the streets, people who arguably are already suffering a form of poverty, and that itself is compounded by the failure to count them. So the idea being these weaknesses on the whole are not random. These are not things that just come up. There are particular forms of power behind them. All right, moving on to something completely different. I'm going to come back to this question later, but let me ask you just to have a look at this. Imagine two measures based on some variables y and x, one being a ratio of the two, and the other being this ridiculous expression here. If you had some interest in what y and x are, let's say, and you had a choice of these two measures, I'd just like you to think about which of these might be preferable. There will be a reveal later on. All right, I'm going to try and move on because I have far too much in here. I'm going to talk through two main bits. Some of the more blatant uncounting stuff, some of the stuff that's just kind of annoying, with a view to thinking about the sort of things that we might want to avoid. Thinking about what the RSS working group might think of as some particular challenges or potholes to avoid, and what kind of measures might do that. And then particularly thinking about the working group in the second part, looking at the opportunities but also the risks around post-2015, and some particular things that come out of that, which will give me an opportunity to talk about, to come back to that question. Okay, if you're paying attention, you'll notice there aren't 50 ways. All right. A particularly blatant way of things being uncounted comes in the choice of reporting. So I'm not going to talk about things that don't get counted, because I think that more or less speaks for itself, but I'll talk about things that get counted and then not reported. So one example, more on the illicit flows side, is done under the heading of commercial confidentiality. The Bank for International Settlements arguably is the only major international organisation that was warning about the causes of the crisis before it happened. In particular, it was talking about shadow banking, the enormous amount of credit creation that happens outside the formal banking sector, and why we should worry about that, which of course is the thing that ultimately caused the crisis. Now the BIS, partly off the back of that worry, began collecting data from its member banks, data which showed exactly the bilateral relationships between different jurisdictions, how much money from one jurisdiction was being held in the banks of another. And that data is extraordinarily useful if you can get hold of it and actually track it through. But unfortunately, the BIS in its wisdom does not publish that data, on the grounds that if they did so, their members would stop giving them the data. And it strikes me this is a use of commercial confidentiality, which is, if anything, designed to ensure that the very practice of unregulated banking continues. And the BIS, to not appreciate that, is just beyond me. More obviously in the development sphere is the second case here, the case of Sudan. Sudan's kind of an extreme case, but you can probably think of other examples that would fit this to some extent. In the 1990s, a group of dissident intellectuals published a thing called the Black Book. And what this showed was that through consecutive, more or less dictatorial regimes after independence, a certain ethnic and regionally specific group had held the vast majority of the political and leading civil service positions. And that book circulated in Khartoum and elsewhere, and in some ways fed into a lot of the politics of the subsequent rebellions in Darfur and elsewhere. One thing they couldn't do, because the data wasn't available, was to look at the extent to which that did or didn't result in particular patterns of development spending, of development outcomes in the more and less marginalised regions. So I did. Because that data is provided not to Sudanese citizens, but to the IMF. Think about accountability of that. I've tried to update this work recently, because the IMF published something showing that they've got more recent data of this form. The IMF refused to give me the data because they said they couldn't get permission from the government in Khartoum, which you can take your own view on. Okay, this is just one little bit of what that data looks like. These are the female infant mortality rates from 1993, with the north, the region that's always held power, but is about 5% of the population. We have the data on a regional basis, not on an ethnic one. The Sudanese very understandably, but unfortunately, don't collect data on an ethnic or ethno-linguistic basis. So we've got a region which maps, but not perfectly. So the 5% in the north, I've indexed that to 100. You can see each of the other regions have significantly higher infant mortality. Now the question is, what's the pattern of development spending that follows this in 1993? And the answer is this. And here you can see the east to a fair extent, but especially the west, Darfur and Kordofan, being effectively, deliberately, and really pretty extremely marginalised in terms of the funds available to deal with, well, female infant mortality, but a whole load of other things. I could equally put up 10 different indicators of human development here, and they would all look the same. So that question of who chooses what data is reported is fundamental, and I should, I hope is seen as part of statistics. All right, the second manipulation. Two types actually, one of the data and one of targets. The data I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but just one short story. I have colleagues at CGD in Washington who produce something called, what's it called now? It's they use the data on the MDGs to assess progress of different countries. They've had trouble in the last couple of years producing that index, which they've been doing every year, because the baseline data keeps changing. Governments are going back in and changing the data for 1990. Not because we suspect that 23 years later they've suddenly had a revelation about what the real numbers were in 1990, but because they're concerned about the progress that they are showing currently. And it's easier in the sense that nobody's collecting the data and getting in the way to change the data in the baseline year than it is to change the data in the current year. If we don't have international development statistics systems that prevent that abuse happening at the kind of scale that it appears to be happening, you have to wonder what value we can put on most of the development statistics we have. All right, the second area is the manipulation of targets. Now, notwithstanding Neil's very neat showing of the positive story of MDG 1, I'm going to tell you a more depressing story about this. This was actually the first, the Rome Declaration at the World Food Summit in 1996 used the language of halving the number of people in poverty, and that included people who are undernourished, but they also had an income element in it. So it was people under $1 a day or the equivalent. They took the baseline year of 1996, which gave them 1.65 million people living in poverty, a target by 2015 of halving it. This should sound familiar, halving the number of people in income poverty, which would have implied 828 million people still under $1 a day in 2015. Now, the MDG 1 target as adopted changed in an important way. Partly the baseline year changed, that didn't have too much impact, but although it kept being reported as halving poverty, this change from halving the number of people in poverty to the fraction of the world population was actually a very significant one. What you see, the baseline changes a bit, but the big deal is that the reduction that's targeted reduces, and you end up saying that, as Thomas Pogge puts this, another 100 and something million people are now morally acceptable to be in poverty in 2015. But the big change came in the revision. What they did was they, as Neil showed in the data, they focused instead on the fraction of the developing world population, which of course shifts things very significantly. And what you end up with is saying that this is the morally acceptable target in 2015, having started with that number in 1996. Think how little progress this is. The real driver of this, there is an argument about how good the data was or wasn't for 1990. I'd say it's still pretty bad now, and it was pretty bad in 2001-2 when this was happening. But what was true at that point was that you could see from the data for 1999 that the most populous region in the world, East Asia, had already achieved the 2015 target because of the performance of China from 1990. So taking the baseline back to 1990 and shifting the language to be the fraction of the developing world population gave you more or less a foregone conclusion. Now, I have celebrated the achievement of this MDG along with many others, but we should be realistic about what's being celebrated there. The absence of any kind of international statistics authority to have a word when this kind of thing happens, to at least challenge it continuing to be reported as the same thing as halving poverty, is a real weakness, and maybe there's a role there for the working group to make a proposal. Okay, more positively onto the post-2015 stuff. Here are some good things, I think. Well, no, let's start with the MDGs. The really good thing about the MDGs, I would say, is not any of the specific targets, it's the fact that there was a gender goal. The power of that was not actually so much in what was in the data collation or achievement of targets that came from it, as it was in the setting of a norm, that it was simply unacceptable not to be trying to have gender equality in education and by implication in a set of other things. The weakness of the MDGs, well, many, as discussed, Neil talked about this, sustainability, but for me, inequality more broadly just wasn't there. So a norm was set on gender, but by omission, something of a norm was set that inequality beyond that wasn't really part of development. Maybe it was too political, it was something else. All right, so the fantastic thing in the high-level panel's recommendations for post-2015 is the disaggregation. What they've recommended is that no target can be considered to be achieved if it hasn't also been achieved by the poorest 20%, by the most marginalised ethno-linguistic groups, by any gender groups, by people living with disabilities, by different age groups, by different regional groups, by urban and by rural. That's extraordinarily powerful and would pretty much put a line through any MDG that you might think has been achieved, with the exception of the income poverty one, in almost every country, because overwhelmingly these things have been achieved where they have been by getting the lowest hanging fruit. So often it's gone hand in hand with greater inequality. And that's where the data revolution is so important. Actually having that data will be itself extremely powerful, quite apart from that criteria for targets. The other thing that excites me personally is they've got illicit flows in there, albeit very badly, and there's a job of work to do to turn that into something meaningful. The bad thing post-2015 for me is that economic inequality is missing, and that's what I want to talk about. They've got that thing for the poorest 20% in terms of achieving something like, say, an educational target, but they don't have a specific target on the actual economic, whether it's income or wealth, inequality itself. Choice of indicators is an interesting one. I'm going to talk about inequality here in a bit of work that I'm doing with Andy Sumner, who's the director at King's International Development Institute. Criteria for indicators in general, certainly for inequality, would seem to fall under these two headings: technical accuracy and political accountability. You don't just want indicators that are technically perfect, you want them to be meaningful to people who might hold their governments or other people to account for actually achieving these things. So if they're technically perfect, but in practical terms meaningless to someone who's not an expert, their role in accountability is going to be, let's say, compromised at best. There is a question of cost, but I would say that cost is not a criteria, it's more a constraint on where you eventually get to. It shouldn't be a deciding factor on what type of indicators you have. All right, let's have a look at an example. For income inequality, these are typically the technical axioms, which frankly I'm not going to spend time talking about. If you know them and are interested, then you know them and you're interested, and if you don't, then it won't be very useful. I think these are kind of interesting, but they're so clearly put together by people who are thinking about mathematical distributions and in no sense about politics, that they are limited. So we propose a set of policy axioms that might make measures more useful. Are the value judgments of using this indicator sufficiently explicit? Because any measure of inequality, whether it's the Gini or the tile, or indeed any other measure, is not neutral. And often I think we tend to talk about, particularly the Gini coefficient, as if it was neutral, when actually it overweights the middle of the distribution and gives less importance to what's happening at the extremes, which might be the bit that we care about, in fact. But at least we should know that that's the measure that we're using. That's what it does. Is it clear what signal is given to policymakers? Thinking about the Gini again, if anyone can define for me the difference between a Gini of 0.39 and a Gini of 0.43, or what that might mean for policymakers, I'd be grateful, but I don't think it can be done. Because in a sense, the Gini captures the entire distribution. Those numbers can reflect completely different distributions which can cross, and therefore it's not even clear what they're telling you about the relative income of the people at the bottom, never mind what the whole distribution actually is. Clarity. Is it clear to a non-technical audience what has changed? I would suggest that for the inclusive process that post-2015 is aiming to be, this is kind of fundamental. If it's not obvious what's changed when the number moves, what's it worth? is the policy response clear? Can the measure also capture inequality between groups? I would suggest makes it useful, particularly given that disaggregation by groups that is now proposed to be run all the way through. So, this is Andy and my proposal, the Palma. Gabriel Palma is a Chilean economist who looks at data for the most recent years, and he found that pretty much regardless of what income level of country you were looking at, there's this stylized fact: the stability of the deciles between 5 and 9, that 50% of the population in those deciles tends to have about 50% of national income, whether it's a very poor country or a very rich one, which is really fascinating. And kind of talks about what that might mean in terms of the professional classes being to some extent able to obtain and defend that share and not on the whole go further, but also not see it move very much. Given that, he then suggests that the politics of distribution is really about the top 10% and the bottom 40. So our proposed measure, which we call Palma, is simply the ratio of these two. The share of national income of the top 10% divided by the share of the bottom 40%. So you'll see if that number is, if the Palma is 1, then the top 10% has per person 4 times the income of the bottom 40%. If the number is 0.25, you've got a completely uniform distribution. In general, of course, the number is above 1, as we'll see. Just on the point of the stability of the middle, these are the coefficients of variation for the highest, the top 10% in blue, and the bottom 40% in red. We did a bit of work to kind of check how strong this stylized fact is. So we looked across countries. That's the coefficient of variation for the middle 50%. As you can see, it's systematically much lower. There's just much less variation there. These are countries where we have data for about 30 years, and again, you see a very systematic pattern. Coefficient of variation middle 50% being much lower. Finally, for some countries where we've got data on the different income stages, this is what happens in the tax and transfer system of these 4 countries. You have a redistribution away from the top 10% in varying degree towards the bottom 40%, as you might expect. What happens to the middle 50%? Answer, pretty much 0. Which again we think is quite striking and certainly confirms Palmer's point. The politics of distribution is about these 2 groups, not this one. Alright, so that gives us some confidence in using the measure. This is, just to give you a sense of it, this is how the Palmer compares to the Gini. Low end, you get a few countries. This is only developing countries as defined by the World Bank in their POVCAL dataset. You get some countries with a Palmer below 1, but not very many, and that's equivalent to a Gini in the mid-20s. The top end, this is the top end of countries that had surveys in 2010, so there are some above, like Namibia, but you see Gini's going towards 60 and Palmer's going towards 5. In fact, if I've got it here, you can do a little exercise if you fix the deciles just to have a look at, so we constructed these to see what a Palmer of 1 to 10 would look like. What we've done is hold equal the income shares within the bottom 40% and within the middle 50%. If you let them vary, what it does is it increases the Gini a little bit in a systematic and predictable way, so these numbers will be a little bit higher, but the same pattern. What you see here, with a Palmer 1, 2, 3, 4, say, the Gini is reasonably, it moves reasonably strongly, but increasingly less. As you get along here, up into the really high inequality, so Namibia in 1990 is somewhere like here, and by 2010 it's got back to about here. South Africa is somewhere around there. So by the time you're getting up to that really high inequality, the Gini pretty much stops moving. I mean, it's moving, but very little. So to be able to say that this difference is in some sense equivalent to this one, or indeed this one, or this one, it doesn't feel like a very intelligible, or indeed intelligent statement. What happens when you look at the real numbers? you see this. There's actually an enormously strong relationship, as you might expect, given they're drawing from the same survey data. Mexico is actually an error, and we haven't yet worked out this one, but we don't think either of them are right. So at the minute, the R-squared's 0.94, probably it's higher than that, meaning there's something very strong going on here. Since the Gini captures the entire distribution, and the Palmer takes only 2 points, this seems extraordinarily strong, the relationship. So it begs a question, which I'm going to come on to. But first of all, if the Palmer is so closely related to the Gini, and the Palmer ignores half the distribution, why? Why would we possibly use it? This is the question people keep asking us. So we have two answers. One is the policy axioms. In our view, the Palmer just wins hands down on this. And that's not to say the Palmer is the only thing you should use, but at the very least, we shouldn't only use the Gini. It's crazy. But there's another aspect to that, which is the flaws in the Gini. This, in fact, is the equation for the Palmer and the Gini, where Y is the income share of the top 10% and X is the income share of the bottom 40%. This is the regression equation using the World Bank's POVCAL dataset, which is basically the dataset of national income and consumption surveys and Gini coefficients, which they generate from that data using a fairly complicated algorithm. When we run a regression, just putting in these two points from the distribution, top 10% share and bottom 40% share, the adjusted R-squared is 1.000, as in this perfectly defines the Gini. So in practice, the Ginis that we all use all the time in development contain no more information than does the Palmer. And they contain it in a way that is, just the opposite of intuitive, and arguably the opposite of meaningful. So the question really is whether you prefer this or this. No, I wouldn't say you should only use the Palmer, but I really think we have to think again about the Gini, and the reliance that we've got on it has just taken us, very far away from having an inequality measure that is meaningful. The idea that we have to convert every set of distributional data we've got into a Gini has led us, and particularly the World Bank, into a really warped process, which has the result. If you use Ginis calculated in different ways, it's not as strong a fit. This is partly about the World Bank's choice of algorithm, which they say is 99.9% perfect. Maybe that's the problem of striving for perfection rather than using the data. Okay, one last thing. The set of things that the working group might want to think about is around how you fund a data revolution. Worth thinking, national statistics offices have received aid that is less than 0.1% of the total. Do we think that's an appropriate allocation? If you think about an NGO doing a project, taking a large amount of funds from a donor, you would typically think of something like 5% as the cost for evaluation and monitoring. Can we get a bit closer to 5% than this? Can't do any harm, right? There's any question about what, at the global level, who has the responsibility for this? And actually, should a lot of this run through the UN? One of the problems that seems to happen in kind of thinking that things sit at the global level is that they're not necessarily done very well. People don't seem to take responsibility. One of the problems we had at Save the Children was the difference between the UN data on mortality rates, particularly child mortality in our case, and the data from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, which is Chris Murray's outfit, funded by the Gates Foundation. Now, they use the same underlying data, which is pretty bad, and then they use different extrapolations. Chris Murray's outfit don't tell you what extrapolations they're using, which is even more annoying. But what it means is you have a choice. If you want to kind of say something about, particularly if you are Save the Children and you're looking for a headline about the amount of progress in reducing child mortality, say, You've got to make a decision about whose extrapolations you prefer when you can only see one of them. Nobody seems to be addressing the underlying problem, that all of the data is really pretty bad. And certainly nobody's looking at funding that or making a big push on even registers of death. Do we not care about poor people dying because they're poor? You know, there's a politics here too. Last thing, going private has kind of attractions, you know, and you can see why the DHS surveys were done through a private outfit in order to get around the problem of weak capacity nationally. But does this really build capacity? And are you kind of circumventing ownership? Is there a problem in thinking that's a long-term fix? And actually, might it be better to have worse data for a while, but think that you're going in a direction of strengthening? Another question that comes up, if you let Gallup introduce questions in the World Survey to feed into the FAO numbers on numbers of people living in hunger, but Gallup and their paying subscribers are the only people who've got access to the entire data set into which that question fits. So most of the people living in most of the countries where that data is being generated probably don't have the access, or indeed the money to pay for the access to that broader data set. Is there a risk that we're kind of going completely against the direction of travel of open knowledge, and again of ownership that we might want? Right, 3 conclusions. I have this big thing I've gone on too long, so I'm sorry. As I may have mentioned, this is about power. It's not just technical decisions, and decisions on statistics are fundamentally political. We can't get away from that. There's no way of saying the political stuff is political and politicians can do that and we're technical people and they'll do something else. Every decision is political in terms of who and what is being counted and who and what is not. And we can't and we shouldn't pretend that we can duck that. But happily, there are great opportunities for progress, it says here. No, I mean this, I do feel very optimistic. I think actually, even up till now, the conversation that's been had within the UN system, across bilateral donors and NGOs, is much, much more engaged on at least half of the points I've raised than I think it's ever been, certainly than I've ever seen, which kind of makes you feel like there is some opportunity here. Question around funding, question around expo engagement, question around getting governments, both donors and developing countries, seriously engaged with this, and that really hasn't happened yet. But maybe that's where the working group has a place to start. All right, thank you.
Now, originally the session had been planned with some room for panel discussion, but the speakers were so interesting I let them finish their presentations rather than cut them off. What it means, I think, is the best thing to do is draw the session to a formal close now so that those of you who are desperate for coffee can go off. But I think the speakers are available to have we're a small enough group that if you want to talk to them personally, I think that's probably the best way to manage this. So at this stage, I think if we can just give a round of appreciation to our 3 speakers, draw the session to a close, and then you're very welcome to talk to them after the formal close. Thanks very much.